back again with film recaps. In this video, I'm going to recap one of a horror thriller films from 2017, titled Get Out. Before we get to the storyline, I'd like to wish everyone a happy and great day. Without further ado, let's get straight to the storyline. The film opens with a black man named Andre, walking alone in a quiet neighborhood, before getting approached by a sketchy white car. Scared, he tries to turn around, but soon realizes that the car door is now open. But from out of nowhere, the driver is quick to knock him unconscious, and drag him inside the car. The next scene introduces us to our main character, Chris Washington, a black photographer who just finished packing up. His white girlfriend, Rose Armitage, shows up at his door, and she is about to take him to meet her parents for the first time. Before they leave, Chris nervously asks her if her parents knows that he's black, fearing that they might be racist, but Rose assures him that her parents harbor no such hatred. On their drive there, Chris calls up his best friend, Rod, who works as an airport security officer, to thank him for taking care of his dog while he's away on this trip. Afterwards, he puts Rod on speaker because Rose would like to say hi to him, but Chris seems jealous after hearing the two banter, so Rose teases him about it. But unexpectedly, a jumping deer hits their windshield, shocking the two. They exit the car to find one of the rearview mirrors broken, and Chris finds the deer dying just by the edge of the woods. They decide to call the police, but in the middle of questioning, the police asks to see Chris's ID for no reason at all. Infuriated because Chris wasn't even the one driving, Rose reprimands the racist cop. The two then resume their journey, until they finally arrive at Rose's parents' residence. It is clear that Rose's parents are well off. Her father, Dean Armitage, is a neurosurgeon while her mother, Missy, is a psychiatrist. But while the father takes him around for a tour of the house, Chris can't help but find it off-putting that the family's groundskeeper and housekeeper are both black. Noticing Chris's discomfort, Dean explains to him that both the housekeeper and groundskeeper used to work as caretakers for his parents, but after his parents died, he couldn't bear the thought of letting them go, so he decided to keep them around. Afterwards, the four of them sit around the porch for a chat, during which the parents announce that they're holding a house party tomorrow. Here we also learn that Chris's mother died when he was young after getting hit by a car. Since the topic seems sensitive, the parents change the subject, and they move on to talking about how they notice Chris to be a smoker based on his mannerisms. The father offers Chris to try Missy's hypnosis therapy, which Dean claims to be effective in helping get rid of that habit. While they chat, Georgina the housekeeper pours them tea, but we can clearly see there's something off about her. Both happy and stressed expressions can be seen in her.
We keep them close to us. Oh.
Upon seeing this, Missy rudely tells the housekeeper to go away. But before we see Chris's reaction, they get interrupted by Jeremy, Rose's younger brother who just came home from med school. During dinner, a drunk Jeremy animatedly shares an embarrassing story about Rose in high school, while Georgina the housekeeper strangely lurks in the background. But afterwards, the atmosphere grows tense as Jeremy begins asking Chris about how well of a fighter he is, and mentions how black people's genetic makeup make them more physically strong compared to white people. Things get even weirder when Jeremy gets up from his seat, and is about to challenge Chris for a fight. Luckily, the parents put a stop to it before things escalate. When the couple are finally alone in Rose's room, she infuriatedly rants about how weird and racist her family's been throughout the day. She apologizes to Chris, because she didn't expect her family to be that way. Later that night, Chris can't seem to fall asleep, so he decides to venture outside for a smoke. But in just a matter of seconds, he encounters the eerie sight of Walter the groundskeeper running straight towards him. But the man simply runs past him. When he turns around, he finds Georgina on the window, checking her own reflection and seemingly unable to see him. When Chris returns inside later, he finds Missy sipping tea in the therapy room, and decides to join her there. Here Missy begins to inquire him about his smoking habit, and asks if he'd like to try the therapy now. But before he answers, she begins stirring the tea, the scraping noise seemingly affecting Chris. She then proceeds to ask Chris very intrusive questions about what he was doing during the time his mother died. Even though reluctant, the sound of the tea stirring somehow inclines Chris to answer. Missy keeps on prodding about that particular traumatic moment from his past, and over time, he begins to cry, and eventually feels paralyzed. And as a final touch, Missy utters one word, sink.
Wait.
Sink.
Which causes him to involuntarily feel as if he's sinking inside his own mind. He desperately tries to reach up, but finds himself unable to. Missy calls this the sunken place. His consciousness has departed from his body, while his body is still paralyzed in the chair. The next thing he knows, he wakes up in Rose's bed to a text from his best friend Rod, and brushes whatever happened last night as a nightmare. He finds that his battery is low, so he plugs it in. That day, he decides to go outside to take pictures of his surroundings, and goes to see Walter the groundskeeper and tries to chat him up. Here we notice that there's something off about him. His eyes seem distant, and his accent sounds like a white person from the 50s. He also brings up about Chris's smoking habit, and asks if the therapy with Missy worked last night, proving to Chris that his nightmare wasn't a nightmare at all. Chris immediately informs his girlfriend about the hypnosis he experienced, prompting her to apologize for what her mother did. He also discovers that the hypnosis was a success, as he no longer feels a desire to smoke. Right after, the two watch from the window as dozens of wealthy white people arrive for the Armitage's annual get-together. Most of the guests are old white people, who begin acting weird at the sight of Chris. One old man seems fascinated to find out if Chris is any good at golf, because Tiger Woods is. They also encounter a lady, who asks Rose if Chris is better in bed since he's black. Lastly, Chris and Rose entertain another old couple, who remarks that black skin is now in fashion, which sickens Chris, so he walks away. He decides to look around for any nice view to shoot with his camera. This is when he stumbles upon another black man in the party named Logan King, and decides to approach him. But just like Walter, he speaks and acts like an old white person, and soon enough, his oddly very old wife walks up to him to inform him that someone would like to see him. As Logan excuses himself, Chris is even more put off by the fact that Logan doesn't seem to understand the way a fist bump works. Later on, Chris finds a blind man at the party named Jim Hudson, whose name Chris recognizes, as he is a well-known art curator who eventually grew blind from a genetic disease. Unlike the others who bring up Chris's race into conversations, the man admits to be a fan of his work, and compliments Chris for having a great eye in photography. As Chris grows tired of meeting people at the party, he heads upstairs, while unbeknownst to him, everyone in the party suddenly quiets down and begins to look up. He returns to Rose's room, and frowns when he finds his phone charger unplugged, though he remembers charging his phone earlier. Suspicious, he checks in the other room and finds Georgina there, concluding that it must have been her who unplugged his phone. He then tells Rose about what Georgina did, but Rose doesn't believe the housekeeper meant any harm by it. Chris stays in the room for a while to call Rod to catch up, updating him that Rose's mother had him under hypnosis to get him to quit smoking. Rod finds this freaky, and mentions that white people love making people sex slaves and shit, but Chris assures him it's fine.
Hello.
Fuck, hi.
He then gets interrupted by Georgina, who also speaks like an old white person, and doesn't understand any modern slangs.
Snitch.
Rat you out.
Chris then confides in her about how being surrounded by so many white people intimidates him. Hearing this, she appears to be trying to say something, but decides against it, and starts crying instead. She says that the Armitages treat her like family, before walking away like a weirdo. When Chris returns downstairs, he finds Dean chatting with a circle of old people, one of whom asks Chris whether being African American is an advantage or disadvantage these days. Chris takes this opportunity to summon Logan to get him to answer, while he secretly takes out his phone to take a picture to show his best friend Rod, because he feels like he recognizes Logan. But unfortunately, he forgot to turn off his flash, and as soon as the camera snaps, Logan has a nosebleed. He then becomes hysterical, and lunges at Chris while screaming at him to get out. The man gets escorted away, and the next scene shows Dean explains to them that Logan is epileptic, and the camera flash triggered him. Logan then walks out of Missy's therapy room to announce that he's feeling a lot better now, and would like to head home with his wife to rest. To lighten the mood, Dean asks the guests to participate in a party game, but Rose notices Chris looking glum, and decides to take him away for a walk. In their absence, the family and the guest actually start holding a weird auction with Chris as the prize. The blind Jim Hudson coming out as the highest bidder in the end. Meanwhile in the woods, Chris confesses that ever since the hypnosis, he's been feeling weird things, and that he feels as if he recognized Logan when the man was freaking out earlier. He also expresses how he wants to go home, so Rose agrees and they plan to return to the city in the morning. The sky is dark when they walk back to the house, and the last of the guests are climbing inside their cars to go home. When Chris is alone in Rose's room, he sends the picture he took of Logan to his best friend Rod. It turns out that Rod knows the man, Andre Hayworth, who used to date one of their friends. Rod begins freaking out after Chris tells him how the man has seemingly changed his name, and seems to be in a relationship with a very old woman now, but Chris's phone battery dies before they could talk further. Realizing that something is definitely off, Chris informs Rose that they have to leave now. Rose doesn't object, though she needs to retrieve her bag first. When Rose leaves him alone in the room, the sight of the open closet intrigues him, so he decides to check it out. It is at this point that he discovers various pictures of Rose in prior relationships with several black guys. Not just guys, there are also photos of her with both Walter and Georgina. Apparently, Chris isn't the first black guy Rose has been with after all. And then suddenly, Rose comes back in to tell him that she's ready to go, though she can't seem to find her car keys in her bag. Not wanting to waste any more time, Chris urges her to go downstairs, but the brother Jeremy is blocking the front door, while Missy stands in the foyer with her tea ready. Sensing tension in the air, Chris asks Rose to find the key, while Dean walks in the room, and starts talking about how the white mind is brilliant, though it needs a better vessel to contain it. Creeped out, Chris loses his patience, and begins yelling for Rose to find the keys. Jeremy then playfully swings his lacrosse stick at him, while Missy and Dean begin to surround him. While this happens, Rose finally reveals to him that she's in on her family's plans all along. When Chris lunges at Jeremy, Missy taps her teacup, causing him to fall under hypnosis again. This leaves Chris with no power, but to watch as the family drags him to the basement.
You were one of my favorites.
Meanwhile in the city, Rod is starting to get worried. He tries calling Chris multiple times but receives no answer, so that night, he decides to do a Google search on Andre, and discovers a missing person article of him. Back to Chris, he finds himself strapped to a chair when he wakes up, unable to break free despite his efforts. The TV in front of him suddenly turns on, playing a recording of a white man, who is none other than Rose's grandfather. He begins speaking about how Chris been chosen because of his genetic advantage as a black man. Up next, a recording of tea being stirred plays, which knocks Chris unconscious again. On the next day, Rod goes to the police trying to report how he suspects that his friend Chris is being held hostage by a white family. He explains that they kidnap black people to be sex slaves, but the police only laugh at him. This doesn't stop Rod. He tries calling Chris's phone one more time, but this time, it's Rose who answers. She pretends to act confused, saying that Chris called a cab abruptly and left 2 days ago, but Rod could see through her lies. However, when Rod begins recording their call, Rose shows her manipulative side by changing the subject and saying that she knows how badly Rod wants to bang her, which weirds him out and gets him to hang up. While this is going on, Chris wakes up again in the basement to find blind John Hudson on the TV. He calmly explains to Chris that a surgical procedure is going to happen, which involves transplanting his brain into Chris's body. After this is done, Chris's consciousness wouldn't be entirely gone, but he will be a passenger in his own body, sinking in the sunken place. As it turns out, Rose's family has been transferring old white people's consciousness into young black people's bodies, granting them preferred physical characteristics and a twisted form of immortality. But in John's case, he wants Chris's eyes the most. After the call ends, Chris notices the cotton sticking out of his armrest, right before the tea recording plays again, forcing Chris to ready himself to pass out. Just in the other room, Dean begins the brain transplant procedure, while Jeremy goes to retrieve Chris. He removes the straps holding Chris to the chair, and gets an IV ready. But when he's not looking, Chris beats him with a lacrosse ball. It is revealed that Chris blocked the hypnosis trigger by plugging his ears with cotton stuffing pulled from the chair. He then eyes the mounted deer on the wall and gets another idea. As Jeremy hasn't returned for some time, Dean goes out to look for him, and this is when Chris shows up and rams the deer horns into him, causing him to bleed to death. The evil man knocks over a candle, which sets fire to the operating room with an anesthetized Jim Hudson inside. Up next, Chris goes upstairs and comes face to face with the mother, knocking the teacup off the table before she reaches for it. She then takes a sharp object and stabs his palm with it. As the two struggle against each other, Chris manages to overpower her and stab her in the eye. When he finally makes it to the front door, a bloody Jeremy shows up and traps him in a headlock while he struggles to reach for the door. Chris manages to stab him in the shin. Chris then stomps his skull to make sure he stays dead this time. While this is going on, Rose is upstairs listening to music and Googling shirtless pictures of black men, unaware of what's going on. Chris finds the car keys and starts Rose's car. However, as soon as he begins to accelerate, he accidentally hits Georgina on his way out. Feeling sorry for her because his own mother also died from a hit and run, he takes her inside the car. But unfortunately, Rose heard the crash and rushes outside with a rifle while saying "Grandma." It is at this point when we realize that Georgina has the grandmother's brain. She then wakes up and begins attacking Chris, infuriated because he's killed her family. This causes a car crash, killing Georgina, but Chris survives. After the car crash, Chris staggers outside the car, avoiding Rose's gunshot. From out of nowhere, Walter the groundskeeper comes running towards him, with Rose saying "Get him, Grandpa." Walter tackles him to the ground, but Chris is quick to take a picture of him with a flash camera, which snaps the real person inside him awake. Walter asks for Rose's rifle, wanting to take care of Chris, but he shoots her in the gut instead. He then turns the rifle on him, before shooting himself. Afterwards, Chris crawls up towards Rose, and begins choking her out of contempt, but doesn't have the heart to kill her. And then suddenly, a police car arrives, and Rose cries out for help. But luckily, it is actually an airport security car, which belongs to none other than his best friend Rod. The two quietly climb inside the car, and drive away, leaving Rose to bleed to death in the middle of the street. And this is where the movie